The stagecoach bucked one last time, a final complaint against the baked earth, and settled into a sigh of dust and leather. For 6 days, the world had been a rattling box of heat and grit. Now, silence fell, heavy and hot. Eliza Whitlow gathered her long skirts, her hands stiff, and descended the iron step into the full, blinding glare of the Arizona Territory. The year was 1876. Tucson Flats was less a town than a scar on the land, a collection of sun-bleached wood buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, red emptiness. The dust, a fine crimson powder, was in the air, on the tongue, and in the soul. It coated the sweat on her brow and settled into the creases of her traveling dress. A persistent wind, hot as a furnace draft, offered no relief, only moving the heat from one place to another. The driver, a whip-thin man called Lightning Jack, grunted as he heaved her heavy wooden trunk and the even heavier, more precious crate containing her camera to the ground. He wiped his face with a bandana that was already the color of the dirt. "Here, water is dearer than whiskey," he muttered, "more to his horses than to her, and whiskey is dearer than the law." Eliza paid him no mind. Her attention was fixed on the horizon. The mountains were jagged teeth against a turquoise sky so pale it seemed scoured by the sun. This was a land of sharp edges and brutal honesty. Nothing was softened here. A man leaning against the livery post, his hat pulled low, watched her unload her gear. His eyes flicked from her face to the polished mahogany box of her camera. "This land has owners," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "By gun or by paper." It was not a welcome, but a simple statement of fact, like commenting on the heat. She gave a curt nod, acknowledging the information without inviting more. She had not come from Missouri seeking comfort. She had come seeking a truth stark enough to be captured on a glass plate. She had been a teacher, shaping young minds with words and numbers. But words could be bent, numbers could be twisted. A photograph, however, held a different kind of power. It held a moment still, a slice of light and shadow that told a story words could not. While Jack unhitched the weary horses, Eliza felt the pull. It was an artist's instinct, a quiet hum in her blood. To the west, a slow procession moved along a low ridge. It was a small party of Apache, perhaps a dozen riders and their families, their forms lean and dark against the setting sun. They were not a threat, not a spectacle. They were simply people, moving through their own land with a grace that seemed to belong to the landscape itself. They were a part of the vast, silent story she had come to record. Without a second thought, she began to unstrap the leather bindings on her camera case. The mahogany box gleamed, a piece of civilized order in the raw wilderness. She worked with a practiced efficiency that drew curious stares. She set up the heavy tripod, its legs sinking into the deep dust. She mounted the camera, a cumbersome contraption of wood, brass, and glass. Finally, she retrieved a prepared wet plate from its light-proof box and disappeared under the black focusing cloth. The world outside vanished, replaced by an inverted, dreamlike image on the ground glass, the dusty street, the tired buildings, all upside down. She adjusted the focus, the brass knob warm beneath her fingers, until the distant figures on the ridge sharpened. They were poetry in motion, a fleeting vision of a life lived in harmony with this unforgiving land. She felt a profound sense of purpose. This was her first photograph in Arizona. This was the truth she sought. She inserted the plate holder, removed the dark slide, and uncapped the lens, counting the seconds in her head, her breath held tight in her chest. When she emerged from under the cloth, blinking in the harsh light, a man was standing nearby, watching her. He was not like the other men of the town. His boots were polished, his coat was clean, and his face was clean-shaven. He had the look of a man who did not fight the land but sought to tame it, to bend it to his will. "That is quite the instrument, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Deacon Hale, at your service." He gave a slight, almost mocking bow. "Eliza Whitlow," she replied, her tone polite but reserved. She was already carefully placing her exposed plate back into its protective holder. "I have seen your kind of work back east," Mr. Hale continued, his eyes lingering on the camera. "Pictures that make wild places look like gardens waiting for a plow." He smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his cold eyes. "Progress has a powerful appetite. Miss Whitlow, and you could be the one to set the table." Eliza paused in her work, turning to face him fully. "I am not sure I understand your meaning, sir." "It is simple. I am a businessman. I am carving a cattle trail through this territory, bringing beef and prosperity with me. But some people, they are resistant to change. They see only what they are losing, not what everyone stands to gain." "And what is it you think I can do about that?" she asked, her hands resting on the warm wood of her camera. He gestured to the device. "That box of yours, it does not just take pictures, it tells stories. I want you to tell my story. I will pay you well. Photograph my ranch, my herds, my hard-working men. Create images that show the promise of this land, the future I am building. In return for your services, you will have not only my coin, but my protection. A woman alone in a place like this finds protection a valuable commodity." The offer hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken meaning. His protection. Protection from what from whom, the implication was clear. He was a man who created the very dangers he offered to shield her from. Eliza looked from his manicured hands to the vast, untamed horizon. She thought of the dignified figures on the ridge, a silent testament to a history that Hale's progress sought to erase. Her camera was not a tool for propaganda. It was an instrument of witness. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I believe we have different ideas about what makes a good story. I photograph what I see, sir, the truth of it." Deacon Hale's smile tightened at the edges. "The truth," he mused, "is a matter of perspective. Miss Whitlow, and in Tucson Flats, some perspectives are more profitable and healthier than others." He tipped his hat and walked away, his polished boots leaving sharp, temporary impressions in the endless red dust. Eliza watched him go, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She had been in this town for less than an hour and had already made a powerful enemy. She turned back to her equipment, her hands moving with a deliberate calm she did not entirely feel. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was fierce, almost violent. She felt a quiet resolve harden within her. She had come to this place for freedom, the freedom to make her own way, to see with her own eyes, to tell the truth as she found it. She now understood that in this land of dust and scarcity, the truth was the most contested territory of all, and her camera, the silent witness of wood and glass, was her only weapon. The days following her arrival settled into a rhythm of dust and observation. Eliza found a small, clean room to rent above the general store, a space that smelled of sun-baked pine and soap. From her window, she could watch the slow, deliberate life of Tucson Flats unfold. She learned the faces of the town, the weary prospectors, the loud and boisterous cattle hands, the quiet Mexican families who had been there long before the town had a name, and the ever-present soldiers from the nearby fort, their blue uniforms a stark, formal color against the endless palette of red and brown. She spent her time walking the periphery of the settlement, her camera and tripod a familiar, if strange, sight. She photographed the twisted, skeletal remains of saguaro cacti, the way the light fell across the canyons at dawn, the patient face of a blacksmith's wife. She was building a portfolio of the place, learning its lines and shadows. But she felt a constant, low thrum of unease. Deacon Hale's presence was everywhere. His name was on the freight wagons. His brand was on the best horses, and his influence was in the deferential way the townsfolk spoke of him. He was the invisible hand shaping this land, and she knew his story of progress was written in ink that washed away other, older stories. The opportunity she had been waiting for, the one she had dreaded, came on a blisteringly hot afternoon. A tip from the blacksmith, Jose Delgado, a man with kind eyes and a network of whispers, sent her hurrying toward the dusty alley behind the saloon. He had only said, "A paper is being signed. You should see what kind of paper." She found a place of concealment behind a stack of empty supply crates, the wood rough against her cheek. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and sun. In the small, enclosed space, a crude table had been set up. Captain Caro of the United States Cavalry stood on one side, his uniform crisp despite the heat, a sheaf of official-looking documents in his hand. Opposite him stood two Apache elders, their faces like maps of time, their long hair streaked with gray. Their dignity was a silent, powerful force in the cramped alley. "This is a mere formality," Captain Caro was saying, his voice patient, as if explaining a simple sum to a difficult child, a gesture of goodwill. "The government wishes to ensure your people have a designated, protected area. We are granting you this land." One of the elders spoke, his English slow and deliberate. "You cannot grant what is already ours. The sky grants the rain, the earth grants the corn, the Great Spirit grants life. A man cannot grant the land his grandfather is buried in." Captain Caro's smile did not falter, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Think of it as a guarantee. Then, a way to protect you from men like Mr. Hale, from settlers who do not understand your ways. This paper is a shield." The second elder, who had remained silent, pointed a long, wrinkled finger at the document. "A shield with a fence. Your paper says we cannot follow the water. It says we cannot hunt where our fathers hunted. It is not a shield. It is a cage." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the mechanism of conquest, not with a rifle, but with a pen. It was Deacon Hale's cattle trail, his promised progress, being paved with lies and legal documents. Her hands moved with a life of their own, her mind sharp and focused. This moment had to be preserved. This quiet, profound act of injustice needed a witness that could not be silenced. She set up her tripod with movements made swift by adrenaline. The black cloth fell over her head, shutting out the world. In the upside-down image on the glass, the scene was stark and clear. The uniformed officer, a symbol of power and order, looming over the two men who represented a history being methodically erased. She worked quickly, her fingers fumbling slightly as she slid the prepared wet plate into the camera. She uncapped the lens, counting the seconds, capturing the silent, tense standoff. She was sliding the plate holder back into its case when a shadow fell over her. A voice, low and gravelly as stones grinding together, spoke a single word, "Ma'am." Eliza froze, then slowly pulled the cloth from her head. The man standing over her was the physical embodiment of the town's harshness, Bark Ledger. She had seen him around, always near Deacon Hale, a wolfish presence. His face was a landscape of sun and violence, his eyes small and hard. He looked from her face to the camera, and a slow, cruel understanding dawned in his expression. He did not ask what she was doing. He did not need to. With a lunge, he grabbed the camera. Eliza cried out, clinging to it, but he tore it from her grasp with contemptuous ease. He lifted the heavy mahogany box high and brought it down against the corner of a crate. The sound was a sickening crack of splintering wood and shattering glass. The polished body split open, the brass lens assembly bent and broken. Eliza gasped, a feeling of violation washing over her. It was as if he had struck her. She lunged, not for the broken camera, but for the slim, wooden box holding her exposed plates. Ledger kicked it, sending it skittering across the dust. One of the glass plates slid out, shattering, but two remained inside. "Get out of here," Ledger snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Before you find some real trouble." She scrambled, gathering the precious plate box, clutching it to her chest like a child. She cast one last, heartbroken look at the wreckage of her camera, her beautiful, precise instrument. Now a heap of ruined wood and metal. Then she turned and ran, her feet slipping in the deep dust, not stopping until the whitewashed walls of the mission infirmary came into view. She burst through the door, breathless and covered in grime, tears of rage and frustration blurring her vision. Sister May looked up from grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. The nun's face was serene, framed by a simple white wimple, but her eyes were sharp and missed nothing.
"Good heavens, child, what happened to you?"
she asked, her voice calm and steady. Eliza could not speak. She simply held out the plate box, her hands trembling. Sister May took it from her, her touch gentle. She led Eliza to a stool, poured her a dipper of cool water from a clay olla, and then examined the box. She carefully removed the 2 intact plates, their collodion surfaces still damp. Sister May was more than a nurse. She was a fixture of the territory, a woman of quiet faith and immense practicality. She understood the forces at play in Tucson Flats better than anyone. She listened without interruption as Eliza's story tumbled out, a torrent of words about Captain Caro, the elders, the broken camera, and Bark Ledger's cold eyes. When Eliza finished, the nun sat in silence for a long moment, looking at the 2 glass plates that rested on a clean cloth. "The truth needs proof." "Child," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "But it also needs a living voice to tell it. A photograph is a powerful thing, but a dead photographer tells no tales." A shadow darkened the doorway. Deacon Hale stepped inside. Removing his hat, he exuded an air of polite concern that was more chilling than any open threat. "Sister May, Miss Whitlow, I heard there was some excitement. My man, Mr. Ledger, can be overzealous in his duties. I do hope you are not frightened." "My camera is destroyed," Eliza said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "An unfortunate accident," Hale said smoothly. He glanced around the simple, clean infirmary. "This is a rough place. Miss Whitlow, not suitable for a lady of your sensibilities. My offer still stands. Work for me, and I can guarantee your safety. You will have a new camera, the best money can buy, and you will be under my protection." Eliza looked at his calm, assured face. She saw the lie of his protection, a shield that was truly a cage. She glanced at the 2 glass plates, the fragile, imperfect fragments of truth she had managed to save. "And if I refuse," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hale's smile was thin. "Then I cannot be responsible for what might happen. The road out of Tucson Flats is a long and lonely one." He placed his hat back on his head. "You have until morning to decide." He left, leaving a silence that was heavier than before. Eliza looked at Sister May, her heart a cold, hard knot of fear and defiance. The choice was stark. She could stay and become a tool for the very injustice she despised, her spirit slowly eroding under Hale's gilded protection. Or she could run. She knew what she had to do. Staying was a different kind of death. She had to leave, but she would not simply flee. She would follow the trail the elders had taken. She would find them. These plates were not enough. She needed their testimony. She needed the living voices to go with the silent proof. "I am leaving," she said to Sister May, the decision settling in her bones, solid and sure. The nun nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of worry and respect. "Then you will need more than a photograph. You will need a guide you can trust. The desert does not forgive mistakes." Eliza stood up, her body aching, her spirit bruised but unbroken. She picked up one of the glass plates, holding it to the light. On its milky surface, a faint, ghostly image was beginning to appear. It was the image of an argument, of a quiet theft, of a truth that refused to be buried in the red dust. It was enough to start with. It had to be. Before the first hint of dawn colored the eastern mountains, Eliza was moving. She met Lightning Jack in the deep shadows behind the livery, the air still holding a phantom chill from the night. He had a sturdy buckskin horse waiting, saddled and ready, along with 2 full canteens and a small sack of dried jerky and hardtack. He did not ask where she was going. His eyes wrinkled at the corners from a lifetime of squinting into the sun. held a quiet understanding. He took the 2 glass plates she handed him, wrapped carefully in layers of her own petticoats.
Keep these safe,
she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Do not give them to anyone but Sister May. He nodded, tucking the bundle into a hidden compartment of his wagon. Some truths are heavier than gold, little lady, and a lot more dangerous. Be careful the desert does not claim you before you find what you are looking for. He pressed the reins into her hand. This one is called Dusty. She is smarter than most men I know. Listen to her. Eliza mounted the horse, her movements clumsy in the dark. She was not a natural rider, but necessity was a harsh and effective teacher. She gave Jack one last, grateful look and urged Dusty into a slow walk, heading away from the sleeping town, away from the false choice Deacon Hale had given her. She followed the memory of the trail she had seen the elders take, a faint track leading into the vast, silent wilderness. The sun rose with a brutal, swift intensity, bleaching the sky and sucking the coolness from the air. The world became a shimmering expanse of rock and sand, dotted with the stark, twisted shapes of mesquite and cholla. The silence was immense, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of Dusty's hooves and the creak of saddle leather. For hours, she rode, the sun a hammer against her back. The initial surge of defiant purpose began to fray, replaced by a growing sense of her own insignificance. She was a single, small speck in an ocean of heat and light. By midday, the wind began to shift. It was no longer a steady, hot breath, but a restless, gusting force that picked at her bonnet and threw fine grains of sand against her face. The sky to the southwest was darkening, not with clouds, but with a strange, bruised yellow haze that was rising from the earth itself. Dusty grew skittish, her ears twitching, her pace becoming uneven. Eliza felt a primal fear, a deep unease that came not from any human threat but from the land itself. The world was holding its breath. Then the breath was released in a furious roar. The horizon vanished, consumed by a solid wall of red dust that moved with terrifying speed. One moment she was in a landscape of harsh clarity. The next, she was swallowed by a screaming, chaotic blindness. The wind shrieked, tearing at her clothes. Sand, sharp as needles, blasted against her exposed skin. She could not see, could not hear, could not think. It was a physical assault, a suffocating force that stripped away all sense of direction and self. Dusty panicked. The horse screamed, a sound of pure terror that was almost lost in the gale. Eliza clung to the saddle horn, but the animal bucked and reared, crazed by the storm. She was thrown, landing hard in the churning sand. She heard the horse's frantic hoofbeats fade into the maelstrom, and then she was utterly alone. She tried to stand, but the wind was a solid wall, pushing her back down. She crawled, pulling her shawl over her head, trying to create a small pocket of air to breathe. The world was a roaring, suffocating tomb of red dust. Time lost its meaning. There was only the wind, the sand, and the desperate, burning need for air. When the storm finally passed, it was not with a gentle receding, but with a sudden, exhausted sigh. The wind dropped, and the dust began to settle, revealing a world transformed. The landscape was softened, its sharp edges blurred by a fresh blanket of crimson sand. The sun was a pale, hazy disk in a sky the color of rust. Eliza pushed herself to her knees, coughing, her throat raw and caked with grit. She was dizzy and disoriented. Every direction looked the same. The trail was gone. Her horse was gone. One of her canteens had been lost in the fall. A profound and terrifying despair settled over her. Lightning Jack's words echoed in her mind. Be careful, the desert does not claim you. She began to walk, stumbling through the deep sand. Her destination no longer a plan, but a desperate, animal instinct for survival. She walked until her legs burned and her mind grew numb. The sun beat down, and her thirst became an agony. Her thoughts grew fragmented. Her vision blurred at the edges. She was a ghost in a red world, and she knew, with a calm and terrible certainty, that she was dying. She fell, and this time she did not have the strength to rise. She lay in the sand, her cheek pressed against the warm earth, and watched as two vultures circled high above, patient black specks in the coppery sky. So this was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a slow, thirsty fade into the dust. It was then that she heard it, the soft scuff of a footstep in the sand. Her vision swam. She saw the blurry shapes of men, 2 of them. Their faces were lean and hard, their clothes stained with sweat and dirt. They were not Apache. They were white men, and the looks on their faces were not looks of rescue. "Well now, look what the storm blew in," one of them said, his voice a rasp. "She is a bit dusty, but she will do." "Bounty on her," Hale said. The other one added, his eyes greedy. "Alive is better," but he did not say she had to be in one piece. Eliza's heart, which had been slowing to a dull, tired beat, began to pound with a new kind of terror. She tried to push herself away, but her limbs would not obey. The first man reached down, his hand a dirty talon, to grab her arm. A sound, soft as a whisper, sharp as a striking snake, cut through the air. An arrow appeared, as if by magic, in the sand just inches from the man's hand. He jerked back with a curse, staring at the feathered shaft. From the rocks above, figures emerged. They moved with a silence and fluidity that made them seem like extensions of the landscape itself. There were 3 of them, their skin the color of the red earth, their bodies lean and powerful. They were Apache. The man in the lead was tall, his face calm and severe, his eyes holding a depth that seemed to encompass the entire, vast horizon. He held a bow in one hand, another arrow loosely nocked. The 2 bounty hunters froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of this silent, sudden threat. They exchanged a fearful glance, then slowly, carefully, began to back away, their hands held high and open. They turned and scrambled away, their panic clumsy and loud in the immense quiet. The Apache leader watched them go, his expression unreadable. Only when they had disappeared over a ridge did he lower his bow. He turned his gaze to Eliza. It was a gaze that did not pry or judge. It simply saw. It saw her exhaustion, her fear, her desperation. He walked toward her, his steps making almost no sound in the sand. He stopped a few feet away and spoke, his English simple, the words spaced and deliberate, as if he were translating them in his mind from a language of stone and wind. "Your trail bites the sand," he said, his voice a low baritone. "The sand will swallow you. Come." It was not a request. It was a statement, as immutable as the sun and the mountains. Fear warred with an overwhelming sense of relief inside her. All the stories she had ever heard, the whispers of savagery and violence, rose in her mind. But the reality before her was a man who had just saved her life with a quiet, indisputable authority. He did not offer her a hand. He waited, with the last of her strength. Eliza pushed herself to a sitting position. The other 2 men remained where they were, watchful and still. The leader gave a short, sharp command in his own tongue. A moment later, a small figure appeared from behind the rocks. It was a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with large, dark, curious eyes. She was holding a small, tightly woven water basket. The man, her father, Eliza presumed, gestured toward Eliza. The girl approached hesitantly, her eyes wide as she looked at this strange, dust-covered woman. She held out the basket. Eliza's hands trembled as she took it. The water was warm, but clean, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, gratefully, and when she was done, she handed the basket back to the child with a murmured, "Thank you." The little girl, Nita, gave a shy, fleeting smile before scurrying back to her father's side. The man watched this exchange, and for the first time, Eliza saw a softening in his stern expression. He had used his daughter as a bridge, a gesture of peace more powerful than any words. He had shown her she was not a prisoner, but a person in need of help. They made a small, sparse camp as dusk fell, a smokeless fire providing a small circle of warmth against the coming chill. Eliza was given a piece of roasted rabbit and another drink of water. She was exhausted to the bone, but she could not sleep. She watched the man, Ko, and his daughter. She watched his quiet, gentle interactions with Nita, the way he mended a strap on her moccasin with deft, patient fingers. This was not the savage of her ingrained fears. This was a father, a protector, a man who belonged to this land in a way she could never comprehend. She eventually drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, wrapped in her own shawl. When she woke, the sun was just rising. The fire was cold ashes. They were gone. Panic seized her for a moment. Had they abandoned her? Was she alone again? She sat up, her heart pounding, and then she saw it. Stuck in the ground just outside the small area where she had slept was an arrow. It was a simple, functional arrow, like the one that had saved her life. But this one was different. Tied around the shaft, just below the flint point, was a single, clean strand of white thread. It was not a weapon left behind by accident. It was a message, a sign. It pointed west, toward a narrow gap in the distant mesas. It was a trail marker, a silent promise. Go this way, it seemed to say. This way is safe. Eliza stared at the arrow, at the small, deliberate touch of the white thread. It was an act of trust, a fragile line cast across the chasm of fear and misunderstanding that separated their two worlds. She did not know where the path would lead, or what dangers still lay ahead, but for the first time since leaving Tucson Flats, she did not feel entirely alone. She stood up, her body still weak but her spirit rekindled, and began to walk toward the west. The white thread was a fragile compass. Eliza followed it, a speck of purpose in the vast, indifferent landscape. The arrow had pointed west, and she walked west, her gaze scanning the horizon for the next sign. She found it hours later. Another arrow shaft buried in the sand near a cluster of rocks, this one marked with a small tuft of rabbit fur. It guided her through a narrow canyon, its red walls rising on either side, offering a brief, welcome respite from the relentless sun. Her journey took on a dreamlike quality. She was a pilgrim following signs she did not fully understand, placed by people she barely knew, moving deeper into a world that was supposed to be her enemy. Yet, with each marker she found, a piece of her fear fell away, replaced by a weary, growing trust. They had not abandoned her. They were leading her. Late on the second day, she saw the thin plume of smoke. It was cleverly placed, rising from a deep arroyo where it would be invisible from any distance. Her steps quickened. As she drew closer, a figure rose from the rocks above, a silent sentinel. It was one of the men who had been with Ko. He watched her approach, then gave a single, low whistle. She found their camp nestled under a cottonwood grove, sustained by a hidden spring that trickled from the rocks, forming a small, clear pool. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary shielded from the harshness of the surrounding desert. There were perhaps 24 people, mostly women and children, their movements quiet and economical. And sitting by the fire, her familiar black habit a startling sight in this wild place, was Sister May. The nun's face broke into a wide, relieved smile.
Eliza, child, thank God, I have been praying for your safety.
Eliza rushed to her, a wave of emotion making her weak at the knees.
Sister May, how did you get here?
The Lord provides, the nun said with a wry twinkle in her eye. And sometimes he provides a broken wagon wheel and a very capable man named Ko who does not believe in leaving a woman stranded. They found me 2 days ago. We are traveling together until we reach the mission at San Xavier. Eliza looked over at Ko, who was watching her, his expression as impassive as ever. He had saved Sister May, too. His protection was not a commodity to be bought or sold. Like Deacon Hales, It was a simple, profound fact of his character. He gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement, then turned his attention back to sharpening an arrow point. Life in the small, hidden camp was a revelation. Eliza, who had only known the Apache from a distance, as a fearsome, abstract concept, now saw them as families. She saw mothers weaving baskets with nimble fingers, old men telling stories to wide-eyed children, hunters returning with rabbits and quail. She saw Nita, Ko's daughter, playing a game with pebbles, her laughter a bright, clear sound in the warm air. Eliza kept her distance at first, not wanting to intrude, feeling like a clumsy, oversized intruder in their graceful world. But Sister May drew her in, asking for help in tending to a young boy's scraped knee or grinding herbs for a poultice. And Nita, her initial shyness overcome by curiosity, began to orbit Eliza, watching her with those large, intelligent eyes. One evening, as the sun set and the canyon walls glowed like embers, a different kind of energy filled the camp. The men built a small, domed structure of willow branches and blankets. They heated rocks in a large fire until they glowed red-hot, then carried them inside the lodge with deer antlers. It was a cleansing ceremony, a sweat lodge, as Sister May explained in a low voice, a time for prayer and purification. Eliza watched from a respectful distance as Ko and the other men entered the low structure. The flap was closed, and from within came the sound of chanting, a low, rhythmic sound that was both alien and deeply resonant. It spoke of a connection to the earth, to the spirit world, a language far older than the one she knew. Hours passed. The moon rose, a silver sliver in the ink-black sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon floor. The air grew cool. Finally, the men emerged from the lodge, their bodies slick with sweat, their movements slow and deliberate. They were cleansed, renewed. Later that night, Eliza could not sleep. The camp was quiet, the only sounds the soft breathing of the sleepers and the chirping of crickets. She was thirsty. She took her canteen and walked toward the spring-fed pool, which lay a short distance from the main camp, shrouded in mist that rose from the cool water into the night air. The moonlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of silver and black. As she approached the pool, she heard a soft splash. She froze, her heart giving a sudden lurch. And then she saw him. Ko stood waist-deep in the center of the pool. The moonlight sculpted his form, turning his skin to polished stone. His back was to her, his shoulders broad and powerful. She could see the faint tracery of old scars across his skin, pale lines that told stories of battles fought and hardships endured. He was washing away the last of the dust and sweat from the ceremony, his movements unhurried and ritualistic. He was a part of the night, a part of the water, a man alone with his thoughts under the silent gaze of the moon. Eliza's first instinct was to turn and flee, to retreat back into the shadows, her face burning with embarrassment. It felt like a profound intrusion, a violation of a private moment. She had no right to be here, to see him like this. He was not the stoic leader or the fierce warrior now. He was simply a man, unguarded and vulnerable. But she could not look away. In that moment, all the layers of prejudice and fear she had carried with her into this land peeled back and dissolved. The stories, the warnings, the image of the savage, they were all lies. What she saw before her was a human being in his purest form, a man of quiet strength and deep, unspoken sorrows. She saw the weight of leadership he carried on those broad shoulders. She saw a man, not a myth. Her foot scuffed a loose stone. The small sound was impossibly loud in the stillness. Ko did not startle. He simply turned his head, his long, wet hair clinging to his neck and shoulders. His eyes found hers in the gloom. There was no anger in his expression, no surprise, only a calm, quiet acceptance. Eliza's voice was a choked whisper, tangled with apology and confusion. I was just looking for water. He stood for a long moment, the water swirling around his waist, the moonlight gleaming on his wet skin. He reached for a piece of soft buckskin he had left on a rock and began to dry his face and shoulders, his movements deliberate. He did not rush to cover himself, his composure absolute. "The water was looking for you, too," he said, his voice low and even, a calm rumble in the night. "Tonight, it found us both." The simple, poetic truth of his words struck her silent. He had taken her awkward intrusion and transformed it into something shared, a moment of serendipity. He was not shamed. He was not angry. He had simply included her in the quiet majesty of the night. She could not speak. She could only nod, her throat tight. She filled her canteen from the edge of the pool, her hands shaking slightly, and then she turned and walked back to the camp, her mind reeling. The image of him in the moonlight was burned into her memory, a picture more powerful and true than any she could ever hope to capture on a glass plate. The next morning, a subtle tension entered the camp. Nita was unwell. The child was flushed with fever, her usual bright energy replaced by a listless lethargy. Ko sat by her side, his face a mask of concern, placing a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. Sister May examined the girl, her touch gentle and practiced. "It is a fever of the lungs," she said quietly to Eliza. "Not serious. If we are careful, but she will need constant care. Broth, cool water, and these herbs to help her breathe." Eliza did not hesitate. "I can help," she said. "I have nursed fevers before." For the first time since she had met him, Ko looked directly at her, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw not a leader or a warrior, but a worried father. He gave a single, grateful nod. A new bond was forged in the quiet anxiety of the sickbed. Eliza stayed by Nita's side, working alongside Sister May, learning to brew the strange, fragrant herbs, coaxing the child to take sips of water. The fragile thread of trust, first spun with an arrow in the desert, then strengthened by a shared moment in the moonlight, was now being woven into something stronger, something tougher. It was being woven into the fabric of a shared life, a shared struggle, a shared hope for a child's recovery under the vast, silent skies of Arizona. The days that followed were a quiet crucible, a time of slow healing that forged new and unexpected bonds. Nita's fever was a stubborn, clinging thing, rising with the heat of the day and receding into a damp, restless sleep at night, in the small, worried space around the child's sleeping mat. A new world opened up to Eliza. She was no longer a guest or a refugee, but a participant, her hands and her heart fully engaged in the simple, profound rhythm of care. She worked under the watchful eye of an old woman named Ishkene, whose face was a beautiful ruin of wrinkles and wisdom. It was Ishkene who showed her how to use the sharpened spine of a cactus, sterilized in the embers of the fire, to press gently on the points of pain and tension in the body. It was not a cure, the old woman explained through a mixture of gestures and the few English words she knew, but a way of speaking to the body's spirit, of reminding it how to heal itself. Eliza, who had always dealt in the clear logic of words and numbers, found herself learning a new language, one spoken in touch and instinct. Her hands, once soft from holding books and chalk, grew rough from grinding herbs and gathering firewood. She looked at them one evening, at the new calluses forming on her palms, and felt not a sense of loss for the woman she had been, but a quiet pride in the woman she was becoming. Nita, in her lucid moments, became her teacher, propped up on her sleeping furs. She would point to things and whisper the Apache words, "Tu" for water, "Chil" for the herbs that made the bitter tea she had to drink, "Nind" for the people, her people, who moved with such quiet purpose around them. Eliza repeated the words, her tongue clumsy at first, but her efforts were always met with a small, encouraging smile from the child. These small exchanges were a balm, a bridge of simple words across a chasm of culture and history. Ko remained a quiet, watchful presence. He said little, but his eyes followed Eliza's every move. He saw the gentle way she bathed Nita's face, the patience with which she listened to the child's whispered lessons. One afternoon, as she sat developing the 2 glass plates she had salvaged. He came and sat beside her. She had built a small, light-proof tent from her shawl and was carefully pouring the developing chemicals, her movements precise and focused. He watched, fascinated, as the ghostly images slowly emerged on the glass. "It holds the moment still," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It does not forget." Eliza looked up, surprised by his proximity and his insight. "Yes," she said, "that is its power. It holds a piece of the truth, so it cannot be denied later." She explained the process to him, how light made a mark on the prepared surface, how the chemicals made that mark permanent. She showed him how to look at the world through an imaginary frame, to choose what was important in a scene. He understood immediately. "It is like when a scout finds a high place," he said, his gaze sweeping across the canyon. "He does not see everything. He sees the trail. He sees the water. He sees the danger. You choose what your glass eye will see." In that moment, she understood that they were not so different. He read the land, and she read the light. Both were searching for a truth hidden in the patterns of the world. He asked about her broken camera, and she told him the story of Bark Ledger, of the brutal, senseless destruction of her instrument. A flicker of something hard and cold passed through his eyes, but his voice remained even. "A tool can be broken," he said. "The one who uses it is what matters." While the small community was wrapped in its own concerns, the world outside was stirring. The story the prospector had carried back to Tucson Flats had grown with each telling. The quiet schoolteacher had not simply disappeared. She had been captured. A white woman taken by the savages. The tale was a spark thrown into the dry tinder of fear and prejudice that always smoldered on the frontier. Captain Caro heard the rumors and saw his opportunity. He publicly declared his solemn duty to rescue the unfortunate Miss Whitlow from her captors. It was the perfect pretext. Under the noble banner of a rescue mission, he could move his troops into the territories Deacon Hale so desperately wanted, clearing the land of its native inhabitants under the guise of law and order. He began to organize a patrol, his actions driven not by concern for Eliza, but by the cold, calculating greed he shared with Hale. The gears of injustice were grinding, preparing to roll forward. One sweltering afternoon, a familiar, lanky figure appeared at the edge of the canyon, leading a mule that was laden with a lopsided bundle. It was Lightning Jack. He ambled into camp as if he were just stopping by for a cup of coffee, his face splitting into a grin when he saw Eliza. "Figured you might be in need of some professional freight services," he said, his voice a dry drawl. "And maybe this—" He unwrapped the bundle on the mule's back. It was a camera. It was not the beautiful mahogany and brass instrument she had lost. This one was older, its wooden body scarred and battered, its lens a little cloudy at the edges. It was a workhorse, not a show pony. Lightning Jack patted its scarred side affectionately. "Found it in a pawn shop in Nogales. The fella said it was cantankerous. I told him that was fine by me." He paused, a humorous glint in his eye. "It is not pretty, ma'am, but it listens better than some important men I could name." Eliza ran her hand over the rough wood, a wave of gratitude so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes. It was more than a tool. It was a lifeline. It was a vote of confidence from a dusty, foul-mouthed stagecoach driver who had become her unlikely ally. Jack brought news as well, his tone losing its jocularity. "The whole town is buzzing," he said, his voice low so only she and Sister May could hear. "They are saying Coe's people took you. Caro is putting together a patrol, coming to rescue you." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We both know what kind of rescuing he has in mind." The news landed like a stone in the quiet pool of the camp. The threat was no longer distant and abstract. It had a name and a direction. They would be hunted. That evening, as the fire burned low, Coe called a council with the elders. Eliza was not invited, but she saw the grim set of their faces, the quiet intensity of their discussion. The fragile peace of their sanctuary had been shattered. Later, Coe found her where she sat, staring into the embers, the new camera resting beside her. "They will come with guns," he said, his voice flat. "They will say they are looking for you. It will be an excuse to spill blood."
"My presence here has put you all in danger," she said, her voice thick with guilt.
"You were in danger," he corrected her, his gaze steady. "We found you. That is the only truth that matters. Now, a new danger comes for all of us." He looked at the camera.
"You said your glass eye tells the truth. Caro and Hale have their story, written on paper with lies. What story will you tell?"
Eliza looked at the battered wooden box beside her. Its lens was no longer an instrument for capturing the quiet beauty of a stark landscape. It had become what she had always known it could be: a weapon for a different kind of war, one fought not with bullets and arrows, but with light and shadow. Her fear had been burned away in the desert, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She would not run. She would stand with these people who had shown her nothing but kindness and dignity, and she would be their witness.
"Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm, meeting his gaze without flinching, "I will tell our story."
The decision to stand and fight did not bring peace, only a taut, waiting silence. The camp, once a place of quiet industry, now hummed with a nervous energy. The men cleaned their weapons, their movements economical and grim. The women packed what little they owned into bundles that could be carried at a moment's notice. Eliza felt the shift in the air, a sharpening of the senses, as if the entire community were holding its breath, listening for the first tremor of violence. Nita's fever had broken, leaving her weak but blessedly clear-eyed. Eliza spent her time with the child, helping her walk a few steps, her small hand a trusting weight in her own. But even as she focused on this small, hopeful act of healing, a part of her mind was always watching, listening. She practiced with the new camera, its mechanism stiff and unfamiliar, her fingers learning its quirks. She was no longer just an artist, she was a chronicler, preparing to document a history that might otherwise be written only in blood and dust. The attack came at dawn. It was the most beautiful and peaceful time of day in the canyon, when the air was cool and sweet and the first rays of sun painted the high rock walls in strokes of rose and gold. The women were by the stream, filling water skins. The thin, blue smoke of the morning cook fires was just beginning to rise. The world was serene, deceptively so. The first sound was not a gunshot, but the sharp, angry buzz of a ricochet as a bullet struck a rock near the stream. It was followed an instant later by the flat, ugly crack of a rifle shot from the canyon rim above. Pandemonium erupted. Women screamed and scattered, grabbing children, scrambling for the cover of the rocks. Another shot rang out, then another. They were being fired upon from above, trapped in the open by the water. Eliza's blood ran cold. She saw Bark Ledger's leering face in her mind, and she knew this was his work. This was not a military action. It was a massacre in the making, a brutal act of terror designed to drive them out. She grabbed Nita, who was frozen with fear, and pulled the child behind a large boulder. Ko and his warriors materialized as if from the earth itself. They had been expecting this, and their response was swift and disciplined. Firing arrows in the few rifles they possessed, they laid down a covering fire, allowing the women and children to retreat to the relative safety of the caves at the back of the camp. The air filled with the shriek of bullets, the thud of arrows hitting rock, and the terrifying, panicked screams of horses. The small herd, tethered near the camp, had broken free, their eyes wide with terror. They galloped blindly through the chaos, a stampeding force of pure animal panic. Eliza saw them coming, a wave of churning hooves and wild eyes, directly toward the cluster of rocks where she and Nita were hiding. There was no time to think, only to act. She threw herself over Nita's small body, shielding the child with her own, pressing them both flat against the ground as the herd thundered past. The ground shook. The air was thick with the smell of dust and panicked horseflesh. A hoof struck the rock just inches from her head, sending a shower of stone fragments onto her back. Then they were gone, their frantic hoofbeats fading up the canyon. Eliza raised her head, her body trembling with adrenaline. Nita was crying, but she was unharmed. As Eliza helped the child up, she saw Ko. He was leaning against the canyon wall, his face pale, his left arm pressed tightly against his side. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his buckskin shirt. He had been hit. The sight of his blood, of his sudden vulnerability, sent a new wave of fear and rage through her. She helped Nita scramble back toward the caves where Sister May was already tending to the wounded. Then she turned back. The fight was a desperate, chaotic exchange of fire. Ko's men were outnumbered and outgunned. She saw one of Ledger's men, a big, bearded man, break from cover, running toward a better vantage point, his rifle held at the ready. He was close, too close, and he was aiming toward the cave where the children were hidden. Without a conscious thought, Eliza ran to where one of the warriors had dropped a heavy Winchester rifle. She had never fired a gun in her life. She had always hated them, the loud, brutal noise of them, the purpose for which they were made. But now, it was simply a tool. The rifle was heavy and awkward in her hands. She lifted it, the metal stock cold and hard against her cheek. She did not aim to kill. That thought was still abhorrent to her. She just aimed in his direction, high, over his head, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a brutal, shocking force, slamming the stock into her shoulder and knocking her back a step. The noise was deafening, a physical blow to her ears, but the bullet went where she had intended. It struck the rock face a few feet above the man's head, whining off into the sky. He flinched, startled by the shot from this unexpected quarter, and scrambled back behind his cover. The brief, desperate act had been enough to turn him. The fight did not last long after that. The Apache warriors, fighting on their home ground, were too fierce, too skilled. Ledger and his men were not soldiers. They were bullies and hired guns. They had not come for a pitched battle. They had come to terrorize and kill the weak. When they met determined resistance, their courage faltered. As quickly as they had appeared, they melted back into the rocks, their retreat punctuated by a few last, angry shots. Silence fell, a heavy, ringing silence that was worse than the noise. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, a foul, metallic tang. And then, a new sound began. A sound that would haunt Eliza's dreams for years to come. It was the sound of a woman wailing, a cry of pure, animal grief. A young warrior, a boy named DeSoto, who had always had a quick smile, lay still on the ground, his eyes open to the sky. He had been a friend to Nita, and had tried to teach Eliza how to fletch an arrow just 2 days before. Now, his life had been spilled onto the red dust of his home. The camp became a place of mourning. The grief was a physical presence, a heavy cloak that settled over everyone. Eliza watched as the women prepared DeSoto's body, their movements full of a solemn, heartbreaking grace. She felt like an intruder on their sorrow. Yet she could not turn away. His death was a part of her story now. Too, her warning shot, her brief, violent entry into their war, had not been enough to save him. She felt a profound, aching connection to their pain. This was not an abstract injustice anymore. It had a face, a name, and a terrible, final reality. That night, there was no council, only a quiet, tense discussion between Ko and Eliza. Sister May had cleaned and bound his wound. The bullet had only grazed his arm, a painful but not serious injury. He stood staring out into the darkness, his silhouette rigid against the star-filled sky. "We will leave at dawn," he said, his voice quiet, but with an edge of cold steel. "We will go into the high mountains, where the trails are known only to us. We will disappear." Eliza felt a surge of protest. "But that is what they want. Ko, they want you to run. They want this land. If you go, you leave it for them. You leave it for Deacon Hale's cattle and his railroad." "My first duty is to keep my people alive," he said, turning to face her, his eyes dark and hard in the moonlight. "Another day like this, and there will be more than one dead."
DeSoto is dead because I kept us here, in the open. I will not make that mistake again. But we have proof, she insisted, her hand gesturing toward the battered camera that she had managed to protect through the fight. We have a weapon they do not understand. We can show the world what Caro and Hale are doing. We can bring the law down on them. Your law, he said, and the words were not an accusation, but a statement of weary fact. Your law is a piece of paper that can be twisted by a clever tongue. My law is the safety of our children. A living family in the mountains is better than a righteous cause in a graveyard. And what happens when their railroad, their progress, follows you into the mountains? Eliza's voice was filled with a desperate urgency. What happens when there is nowhere left to run? This is not just a fight for this canyon. It is a fight for everything. If we do not stand here, now, with the truth we have, we will lose it all. He was silent for a long time, the weight of his responsibility, his history, and his grief settling heavily upon him. He looked at her, at this strange woman from another world who spoke of justice and truth, who had thrown her body over his child, who had fired a rifle to protect them. He saw her courage, but he also saw her naivety, and he saw the truth in her words. He did not agree. He did not disagree. He simply stood there, a leader caught between two impossible choices: the duty to protect his people by running, and the duty to protect their future by fighting. The canyon was quiet now, but the battle for its soul, and for the soul of everyone in it, had only just begun. The tense debate between running and fighting settled not in words, but in a shared, unspoken decision. Coe did not choose Eliza's path over his own. He fused them, to fight with the truth. They first had to possess it, not just in a photograph, but in the black and white ink of their enemy's own making. To protect his people, he had to do more than hide them in the mountains. He had to cut the throat of the serpent in its den. The plan that formed was born of his strategic mind and her understanding of the white man's world. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble they would return to Tucson Flats. The new moon provided a cloak of perfect, impenetrable darkness. Under its cover, a small, determined group slipped through the desert like ghosts. Coe and Eliza rode alongside Lightning Jack, who had guided them along forgotten trails that bypassed any military patrols. They met Jose Delgado at his smithy at the edge of town, the forge cold and silent, the air smelling of charcoal and iron. The plan was a clockwork of trust and timing. Each person was a vital gear. Jose the blacksmith, whose craft had taught him the secrets of metal and locks, had spent a day fashioning a set of slender picks and a tension wrench from hardened steel. Lightning Jack, who knew the town's rhythms better than his own heartbeat, had charted the night watchman's lazy, predictable circuit. Sister May, their unwavering moral compass, had the most dangerous role of all, creating a diversion that was both dramatic and believable. At precisely 1 hour past midnight, the clock began to tick. Sister May, her face a mask of frantic concern, hammered on the door of the fort's infirmary, claiming that one of the prospectors in her care had been bitten by a rattlesnake and was near death. The commotion, as she had intended, drew the attention of the small night garrison, pulling men away from the center of town. As the shouts and running footsteps faded toward the fort, the four figures detached themselves from the shadows of the smithy. They moved through the back alleys, their footsteps muffled by the deep dust. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer from the saloon and the faint, sweet smell of night-blooming flowers from a hidden courtyard. They reached the solid, imposing back of Deacon Hale's office, a building that spoke of money and power. "Now," Jack whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The watchman is at the far end of the street, checking the livery. You have got maybe 10 minutes." Jose went to work on the heavy lock, his tools moving with a surgeon's precision in the dim starlight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, metallic clicks as he felt for the tumblers. Eliza held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Coe stood perfectly still, a shadow among shadows, his senses stretched, listening for any sound that was out of place. With a final, soft snap,
The lock gave way. The office was a different world. It was a space of order and ambition, smelling of expensive leather and cigar smoke. A large oak desk dominated the room, its surface neat and organized. Moonlight from the front window cast a pale rectangle of light on the floor, illuminating a large, detailed map of the territory that was pinned to the wall. They worked quickly, their movements a silent, frantic dance. Ko moved to the window, keeping watch on the street, while Eliza went straight for the desk. She did not bother with the locked drawers. She knew the documents she sought would be in the place Hale felt was most secure, his large, iron safe, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. Jose knelt before it, his ear pressed against the cold metal, his fingers spinning the dial with a delicate, practiced touch. The clicks were tiny, almost imperceptible. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. From the street came the sound of the watchman's heavy, approaching footsteps. Ko gave a low, soft whistle, the sound of a night bird. The safe door swung open with a well-oiled sigh just as the watchman's shadow passed the front window. Eliza's hands trembled as she reached inside. She found them immediately, a sheaf of land cession contracts, the same kind she had seen the elders being forced to sign. The signatures were crude, hesitant marks, stark evidence of coercion. But behind the contracts, she found something else. It was a series of engineering drawings, detailed plans for the construction of a dam at a place called Agua Fria Canyon, the very place where the main spring fed the stream her new friends depended on. And with the drawings was a folded document, bearing the official seal of the United States Army. Her blood ran cold as she read it. It was a military order, authorizing the immediate seizure of the Agua Fria Canyon for strategic purposes and declaring any native presence within a 5-mile radius a hostile threat. The order was signed by Captain Caro. This was the true shape of their plan. It was not just a cattle trail. Hale was going to steal their water, the lifeblood of the entire region. He was going to dam the canyon, cutting off the ancient migration routes, making the land uninhabitable for the Apache, forcing them to either starve or submit. And he was going to use the authority of the United States military, with a forged document, to do it. A shout from the street shattered the silence. The watchman, his curiosity finally piqued by the disturbance at the fort, had circled back sooner than expected and seen the faint light from Jose's lamp. They were trapped. Jose and Jack bolted out the back door, disappearing into the labyrinth of alleys. But Eliza and Ko were still inside, holding the damning proof. There was no time to follow. The front door burst open. Ko moved with a speed that defied belief. He grabbed Eliza's arm, pulling her toward a small side window that opened onto the narrow space between the buildings. He shattered the glass with his elbow, the sound sharp and violent, and pushed her through. He followed a second later, just as the watchman and 2 other men burst into the office. They were in a narrow, dark space, the adobe walls rough against their backs. The only way out was up. Ko found purchase on a rain barrel and scaled the wall, his movements fluid and silent as a cat's. He reached down, his hand a firm, strong grip on hers, and pulled her up after him. They were on the flat, gravel-strewn roof. Below, the town was coming alive with shouts and lights. They ran, their feet crunching softly on the gravel, leaping the narrow gap to the next building, a long, low structure with a gently sloping tin roof. Their footsteps on the tin were a thunderous announcement of their presence. A shot rang out from the street below, the bullet whining past Eliza's head. They scrambled down the far side of the roof, dropping into the deep shadows of another alley. They ran, ducking through narrow passageways, past sleeping dogs that erupted into a frenzy of barking. The whole town was now a hunting ground, and they were the prey. They finally found refuge in the warm, metallic-smelling darkness of Jose's smithy, collapsing behind the cold forge, their lungs burning, their bodies trembling. The sounds of the chase faded as the disorganized posse ran past, heading in the wrong direction. In the sudden,
profound silence. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on Eliza. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from a deep, primal fear that left her feeling hollowed out and fragile. She looked at the papers clutched in her hand. The proof they had risked everything for. "I was so afraid," she whispered into the darkness, the admission costing her more than the rooftop run. Ko was beside her, his breathing already steady, his presence a solid, calming anchor in the chaotic aftermath. He did not offer empty reassurances. He did not tell her not to be afraid. He simply looked at her, his eyes adjusting to the deep gloom, and saw not a frightened woman, but the person who had stood her ground in his canyon, who had insisted on this dangerous path because she believed in the truth. "I do not need you to be a warrior," he said, his voice low and steady. "A quiet force in the darkness. I do not need you to be like anyone but yourself. I only need you to stand on the side of the truth." His words were a gift. He was not asking her to change, to be harder or braver. He was validating her for who she was, for the very core of her beliefs that had led them both to this moment. In the warm, dark air of the smithy, surrounded by the tools of fire and force, they found a moment of absolute peace. She looked up at him, at the strong, calm lines of his face, and saw not a stranger from another world, but her partner, her ally. He leaned down, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation, but of recognition. It was a quiet affirmation of the trust that had been forged in the desert, tempered in crisis, and now sealed in the shared danger of the night. It was as quiet and profound as the desert night, and just as sure. The fragile peace forged in the smithy's darkness was shattered by the grinding protest of iron wheels on stone. Dawn had barely broken, but the sound was an ugly intrusion, a mechanical growl that did not belong in the quiet canyon. From a high lookout, they saw the serpent arrive. Deacon Hale rode at the head of a grim procession, not with the formal might of the cavalry, but with a motley, more dangerous army of his own. Bark Ledger was at his side, a feral grin on his face, and behind them trailed a dozen hardened men, their faces grim under the brims of their dusty hats. They were not soldiers, they were hired guns, their loyalty bought with Hale's coin. And behind them came the true instrument of destruction, 2 heavy freight wagons, groaning under the weight of a massive iron drilling machine and stacks of raw timber. They had come to build their dam. They did not come alone. Prodded along by riders on the flanks was a herd of several hundred longhorn cattle, their horns a thicket of deadly points. The purpose of the herd was chillingly clear. It was a weapon, a living battering ram to be used against the people of the canyon. Ko moved with a calm, lethal focus. There was no time for debate, no room for hesitation. The plan he laid out was simple and desperate. The women, children, and elders, with Sister May guiding them, were to retreat to a series of high, shallow caves that offered the only real cover in the narrow canyon. Eliza, with her camera, and 2 young warriors would climb to a hidden ledge on the opposite wall, a precarious perch that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the canyon floor. Ko and the remaining warriors would use the rocks and gullies to harass Hale's men, to slow their advance, to draw their fire, and to give Eliza the time she needed. Their objective was no longer to win a fight, but to survive long enough to expose the truth. The air grew thick with heat and tension. Below, Hale's men began the laborious process of unloading the heavy drilling equipment near the narrowest point of the stream. They worked with a swaggering confidence, laughing and shouting, secure in their numbers and their firepower. Captain Caro was there, too, standing beside Hale, his blue uniform a stark symbol of corrupted authority. He was not leading the attack. He was merely observing, lending the brutal affair a thin, obscene veneer of official sanction. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled up the steep rock face, the heavy camera and tripod a dead weight on her back. The ledge was barely wide enough for the 3 of them, a sliver of rock with a dizzying drop below. She worked with frantic, fumbling hands, setting up the tripod. Her knuckles scraping against the rough stone. The sun was climbing, turning the canyon into a furnace. Dust, stirred by the nervous cattle, rose in a fine red haze, catching the light, making the air shimmer. The first phase of the attack was not with guns, but with terror. At a signal from Ledger, the riders at the back of the herd fired their pistols into the air. The cattle, already agitated, exploded into a stampede. It was a terrifying spectacle. A wave of muscle, horn, and blind panic funneled directly toward the mouth of the caves where the families were hiding. The ground trembled. The roar was a physical force, a wall of sound and fury. Coe and his men, positioned in the rocks, loosed arrows and fired their rifles, not at the men, but at the ground in front of the stampede, trying to turn the lead animals. It was a futile gesture, like throwing pebbles into a flood. The herd was a force of nature, and it was aimed with malicious intent. From her perch, Eliza focused her lens, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the brass knob. The world in the ground glass was an upside-down nightmare of dust and motion. She could see the terrified faces of the women and children as they pressed themselves deeper into the shallow caves. The warriors firing from the rocks, the riders goading the herd on. And she saw Captain Caro. He stood beside Hale, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. As the stampede reached its peak, he raised his hand, a clean, white gesture in the swirling chaos. "Fire!" he commanded, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the din. "Fire on the caves. Do not let them break and run." It was the moment, the irrefutable proof. The frame of her photograph held it all, the uniformed officer of the United States Army, the unarmed people cowering in the rocks, the hired guns turning their rifles not on warriors, but on families. She uncapped the lens, her mind a silent, frantic prayer, counting the seconds, capturing the light of this terrible, damning truth onto the fragile glass plate. A volley of rifle fire erupted from Hale's men, the bullets kicking up spurts of dust around the mouth of the caves. A woman screamed. At the same instant, the physical confrontation exploded. Coe, seeing his family directly threatened, seemed to launch himself from the rocks. He moved with a breathtaking, focused rage, a blur of motion that carried him across the open ground and up the scree slope where Bark Ledger stood directing the riflemen. The duel was brutal and primal. Ledger, taken by surprise, fired his rifle, the shot going wild. Coe was on him before he could fire again, and the rifle was useless. A club in Ledger's hands. He swung it, a heavy, vicious arc that Coe ducked under, his own knife flashing. Ledger was bigger, a brute who fought with sledgehammer blows. Coe was faster, a phantom who used the uneven ground to his advantage, his movements a deadly dance of evasion and attack. They grappled on the edge of a rocky precipice, two forces of nature locked in a struggle to the death. Eliza, having secured her first plate and fumbling to insert a second, looked down from her ledge and saw a different, more personal moment of decision. Captain Caro, caught up in the fury of the battle, had moved forward from his position beside Hale. He was shouting orders, directing the fire, his back momentarily turned to her. In the chaos, one of the Apache warriors had managed to shoot Caro's horse from under him. The captain was now on foot, exposed, his pistol still in its holster. And near her, on the ledge, was the Winchester rifle the young warrior had carried. It was loaded. The thought was a flash of white-hot fire in her mind. All the injustice, the cruelty, the death of the young DeSoto, the terror in Nita's eyes. It could all be ended. One shot, one act of final, definitive justice. Her hands left the camera. She picked up the rifle. It felt heavy, solid, an instrument of absolute power. She raised it to her shoulder, the stock fitting into the groove bruised by her first shot. She looked down the long barrel and centered the sight on the back of Captain Caro's blue uniform. Her finger tightened on the trigger. She saw his face in her mind, his smug, confident smile as he presented the false treaty. She saw Bark Ledger bringing his boot down on her camera. She saw the lifeless eyes of the young warrior. And then she saw the glass plate, resting in its wooden holder beside her. It contained a truth more powerful than a bullet. A bullet would kill one man, but it would make her a murderer, and it would bury the story forever. Caro would be a martyr, a soldier killed in the line of duty. But the photograph would kill a lie. It would put Hale and Caro in a different kind of grave, a prison of their own making, built with their own greed. Her hands were shaking. With a choked sob of frustration and clarity, she lowered the rifle. She turned back to her camera, her allegiance, her weapon. She chose the future over the present, justice over revenge. She chose to save the proof. At that exact moment, a new sound ripped through the canyon, a sound so alien and powerful it seemed to tear the fabric of the sky. It was a long, shrieking blast of a steam whistle, a sound that spoke of iron and industry and a world far from this isolated, bloody conflict. Everyone froze. Hale's men, Coe and Ledger. Caro, all of them looked up, stunned, toward the mouth of the canyon. Sister May, having led the families to safety, had slipped away. With Lightning Jack, she had made her way to the railhead, a few miles distant, where a small test engine, part of Hale's grand project, sat on a newly laid spur of track, a head of steam in its boiler. She had climbed into the cab, seized the rope, and pulled. The whistle shrieked again, a desperate, wailing cry for help. A summons. It was a signal that the isolation of the canyon had been broken, that the world was now watching. And in response to that signal, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was not the cavalry. It was the town. Prospectors, merchants, Mexican families, even some of the off-duty soldiers from the fort, drawn by the sound, coming to see what fresh madness had gripped their territory. Witnesses were coming. The spell of violence was broken. Hale's men looked at each other, their paid bravado evaporating in the face of unexpected scrutiny. This was supposed to have been a quiet, private war. Now, the whole world was coming to watch. The fight was over. The battle for the truth had just begun. The steam whistle's echo died, leaving a profound and ringing silence in its wake. The dust began to settle, revealing a tableau frozen in disbelief. The arriving townsfolk, a curious and armed rabble, crested the rise at the canyon's mouth and stopped, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe at the scene of private war before them. The spell was broken. In that moment of stunned inaction, the serpent shed its skin. Bark Ledger, his face a mask of fury and frustration after his inconclusive duel with Coe, was the first to grasp the new reality. He was a creature of instinct, not allegiance. He saw the tide turn, saw the arrival of witnesses, and knew the game was lost, with a final, venomous glare at Coe, a silent promise of future vengeance. He disengaged and melted back into the rocks, vanishing as completely as a lizard into a crevice. He did not run. He simply ceased to be there. Deacon Hale's face, usually a mask of calm control, had paled to a sickly white. His hired guns, seeing their paymaster's authority crumble and their leaderless enforcer disappear, began to edge away, their bravado gone. They were not men who fought for a cause. They fought for coin, and the risk had just become unacceptably high. They began to drift away in twos and threes, eager to disappear before any real questions were asked. Captain Caro, however, was trapped. His uniform was his cage. He could not run. He could only stand, his face a mixture of shock and sputtering indignation. As the commander from the fort, a grizzled major drawn by the commotion, rode up with a small contingent of regular soldiers. The aftermath was a slow, grinding process of unraveling lies. Back in Tucson Flats, the story was not told in whispers in the alleyways, but in the full, harsh light of public scrutiny. In the dusty plaza in front of the sheriff's office, Sister May, her voice clear and unwavering, presented the stolen documents. She held up the fraudulent land cessions, their coerced signatures a testament to Hale's greed. Then she held up the forged military order, its language cold and official,
its purpose nothing less than state-sanctioned theft. The fort's major compared the signature on the order with Captain Caro's signature on a half-dozen other official documents. The forgery was skilled, but undeniable under the major's experienced eye. The foundation of Hale's enterprise began to crack. But the final, devastating blow was silent. Eliza, her hands steady now, set up her battered camera and tripod, but instead of taking a picture, she used it as a stand, propping up the single, precious glass plate she had saved from the battle. She had made a print, a stark, black and white image on a piece of treated paper, and she pinned it to a board for all to see. The photograph silenced the crowd. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It showed Captain Caro, his arm raised, his mouth open in command. It showed the hired guns with their rifles leveled, not at warriors, but at the dark mouth of a cave where the terrified faces of women and children were visible. It was a portrait of a massacre that had been narrowly averted. It was the truth, frozen in light and silver, and it was irrefutable. Captain Caro was placed under arrest, his protests of a misunderstanding falling on deaf ears. Deacon Hale was not arrested. His crimes had been cloaked in layers of legal maneuvering, but his power was broken. His reputation was shattered, his name now synonymous with fraud and violence. The cattle trail was a dead dream, and the dam at Agua Fria would never be built. The town was split. Many looked at the photograph and felt a deep, stirring shame. They had allowed Hale's ambition to fester in their midst, had turned a blind eye to the quiet injustices committed in the name of progress. Jose Delgado and Lightning Jack found themselves surrounded by men who shook their hands, their eyes holding a new respect, but others were resentful. They saw the disruption of order, the humiliation of a military officer, and the elevation of the Apache from a distant threat to a group with rights and a voice. The line of justice had been drawn, but it had cut the community in two. While Tucson Flats wrestled with its conscience, a quieter, more profound reckoning was taking place in the canyon. There was no trial, no public verdict. There was only a ceremony of grief for the young warrior. Dasoda. They gathered as the sun went down, the canyon walls glowing like the embers of a dying fire. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and the low, rhythmic sound of a single drum. Dasoda's mother sang a song of mourning, her voice a raw, beautiful instrument of sorrow that seemed to speak for the land itself. Eliza stood with the other women, her head bowed, not as an observer, but as a participant in their collective pain. She had felt the wind of the bullet that had struck him down. She had seen the life fade from his eyes. His death was a part of her, a scar on her soul that would never fully heal. She felt Ko's presence beside her, a solid, silent pillar of shared grief. In that moment, surrounded by a sorrow she had come to feel as her own, she knew, with an absolute certainty, that she was home. A few days later, after the raw edges of grief had begun to soften, she and Ko sat by the stream, watching Nita, fully recovered now, skip stones across the placid surface of the water. The legal battles in the town were over, but the question of the future remained, a vast, unmapped territory before them. "The paper you brought back from the town," Ko said, his voice thoughtful. "It is a strong shield. It stopped Hale's guns." "It is one kind of shield," Eliza agreed, looking at his strong, calm profile. "But it is not the only kind. It does not protect against everything." "Nita will grow up between two worlds," he said, his gaze fixed on his daughter. "The world of our people and the world of towns and papers. One shield will not be enough for her. She will need two." Eliza looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Among my people," he explained, his voice low and steady, "when a man and a woman choose to make a life together, to protect a child together, there is a ceremony. A blanket is wrapped around their shoulders, binding them as one family in the eyes of the spirits and the community. It is a shield of belonging. It would tell our people that you are one of us, that Nita is your daughter as much as she is mine." He paused,
letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet air. And your world has its own ceremony. A piece of paper, signed in a book. It is a different kind of shield, a shield of law. It would tell your people the same thing. It would prevent any man like Hale from ever trying to say that Nita does not belong with you. Eliza's heart felt full enough to burst. This was not a proposal born of romance or passion, though she knew those things were there, unspoken, between them. This was something deeper, more practical, and infinitely more profound. It was a plan for a life, a conscious decision to weave their two worlds together to create a fortress of love and protection for a child. It was the ultimate expression of the trust they had built, a recognition that their love was not just for each other, but for the future they could build. It was the third way, the path they would have to create for themselves, with their own hands. Yes, she said, her voice soft but sure, a quiet vow spoken by the life-giving water of the stream. Yes, she will need two shields, and we will hold them together. There were two weddings, one of the earth and one of paper, and together they formed the two shields Ko had spoken of. The first took place in the canyon, not with a minister and a book, but with the entire community as witness and the sky as the roof of the church. Ishkene, the old woman whose wisdom was as deep as the lines on her face, brought forth a blanket woven with the colors of the desert sunset, deep reds, soft purples, and a single, vibrant thread of turquoise running through the center. Eliza and Ko stood before the elders, with Nita between them, her small hands holding one of each of theirs. They did not exchange rings or speak formal vows. Instead, the old woman wrapped the heavy blanket around their three shoulders, enclosing them in a single, shared space. The wool was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and sage. It was a physical representation of their new reality. Three people, from two different worlds, now bound as one family, protected by the embrace of the community. The people began a low, soft chant, a song of blessing and continuity. In that moment, under the weight of the blanket, Eliza felt the last of her old world's loneliness fall away. This was the shield of belonging. The second ceremony was a stark contrast. A few days later, they rode into Tucson Flats, not as fugitives, but as a family. They went to the small, sun-baked adobe office of the circuit judge, a weary man who had seen too much of the territory's harshness to be surprised by anything. Sister May was there, her presence a quiet benediction, and Lightning Jack stood as their other witness, his hat held awkwardly in his hands, his face scrubbed clean for the occasion. The judge read the simple words from a book, his voice a monotone drone. Eliza and Ko signed their names in a heavy ledger. It was a sterile, legal transaction, devoid of poetry or spirit. Yet, as Eliza looked at Ko's strong, deliberate signature next to her own, she felt the second shield lock into place. This piece of paper gave them a standing in the world that had tried to destroy them. It protected Nita, giving her a legal claim to both a mother and a father in the eyes of the law. It was a shield forged not of wool and prayer, but of ink and statute. And in this new, complicated world, it was just as vital. They did not settle in the canyon or in the town. They chose the third way, a small, abandoned homestead that lay in the borderlands between the two, with a sturdy porch and a clear view of both the dusty streets and the distant mesas. And it was here that they began to build their future, not just for themselves, but for everyone. Eliza started what the children came to call the Under the Porch School. Each morning, a small, diverse group of students would gather in the shade of the long porch. Nita sat beside the son of a prospector, and the daughters of Jose the blacksmith learned their letters next to two shy Apache boys who had ridden down from the canyon. Eliza taught them to read and write, to understand the strange, powerful magic of words on a page. But she also taught them to see. She brought out her battered camera and showed them how to frame a picture, how to find the story in a face, in a landscape, in a shaft of light. She was giving them a new language, a way to tell their own truths. At the same time,
Ko began his own school, one without walls or a roof. Twice a week, he would take a group of older boys, a mix of Apache youths and town boys who were tired of saloon brawls and aimless days, and lead them into the wilderness. He did not teach them to fight. He taught them to survive. He taught them how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to track a deer, and how to understand the quiet, subtle language of the land. He was teaching them respect for the earth and for each other, showing them that the skills needed to live were more important than the color of a man's skin. The bridge between their two worlds was built not with grand gestures, but with these small, patient acts of sharing. The town began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The fear and suspicion did not vanish overnight, but they began to recede, replaced by a grudging, growing understanding. One afternoon, a group of the children were gathered around Lightning Jack as he struggled to fix a broken wheel on his wagon. The iron tire had slipped, and the spokes were loose. He grumbled and cursed, a steady stream of colorful commentary that made the children giggle. "All right, you little coyotes, pay attention," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Knowing your letters is fine and dandy, and tracking a jackrabbit is a useful skill, I suppose, but the whole world, from here to St. Louis, runs on wheels, and wheels break." He showed them how to heat the iron tire in a fire, making it expand, and how to fit it back over the wooden rim. He showed them how to douse it with water, making the metal shrink and tighten, gripping the wood with incredible force. He stood back, admiring his work, and looked at the circle of small, smudged faces. "The law out here is simple," he declared, his voice full of mock solemnity. "Any person who knows how to fix a wheel is a good person. Remember that. It is more useful than most of the laws they write in books." The children laughed, a mixed chorus of voices from two different peoples, united in the simple, practical wisdom of a dusty stagecoach driver. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. But the West was not a place for simple endings. Hope was a fragile crop, and the seeds of hatred, once planted, had deep roots, miles away. On a high, lonely ridge overlooking the territory, a man watched the distant plume of smoke from the smithy's forge. Bark Ledger sat his horse, his face hard and unreadable, his eyes missing nothing. He was a patient man. He had been beaten, but not defeated. The world was changing. But he was not. He was a creature of the old ways, of violence and simple, brutal greed. He watched the tiny, distant signs of a new community being born, and he waited. His war was not over. It was only sleeping. Back at the homestead, Eliza stood on the porch, watching Ko walk up the path with Nita on his shoulders. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same fiery colors as the blanket that now lay across their bed. They had not found a perfect world. They had not erased the lines that divided people. They had simply stood their ground and begun the hard, slow work of building their own path. A third way, paved with the stones of truth, respect, and a love they had chosen for themselves. The shadow of men like Ledger might still fall across their land, but they would face it together, protected by the two shields they held as one. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.